When it comes to being a Christian, the Bible teaches that the way forward is to go to the back of the line. The Bible teaches that the way up is to climb to the bottom of the ladder. The Bible teaches that the way to get things done is to humble yourself in the sight of the Lord. Now, all of us would give assent to that idea, but in reality, it's hard to do. In reality, it's hard because we think we know how to get things done, and we think we know how to move forward, and we think that we've got a better way to get to the top. Humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due season. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 6, and James chapter 4, verse 10. We need to learn to boast in weakness, to be humble. Open your Bibles, if you haven't already done so this morning, to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Our lesson will come from that passage. We've read the book of 2 Corinthians as a congregation in recent weeks. This week we concluded our reading, chapters 11 through 13. And I want us to talk about what happens in this chapter, 2 Corinthians chapter 11. If you were going to give a caption of the last four chapters of 2 Corinthians, chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13, you could caption it this way: a model of Christian maturity. A model of Christian maturity. What does it look like to be a grown-up Christian? What does it look like to be a servant of Jesus Christ? What does it look like, really, to climb to the bottom of the ladder, to go to the back of the line, to humble yourself and to be a servant of all? And Paul is in a dilemma as you read these last four chapters of 2 Corinthians, because what's happened in the church where he has worked in Corinth is that some false teachers have entered in, false apostles. They claim to be apostles, but they're teaching different things. And these false apostles, the way that they gain influence among the church is to say, look at what we've accomplished. And listen to how eloquent we are in our speech and the wisdom that we have. And the people in the church were being taken in by this. And they were taking their spiritual resumes and they were listing them for the church. And it was pretty impressive to look at. And then the church is kind of looking at Paul and saying, okay, Paul, where's your resume? How do you stack up? How do you measure up to these false apostles, although they didn't think they were false? We want to hear your accomplishments. We want to hear what you've done. And for 4 chapters, what Paul does is amazing, because it is obvious as you read chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13, it is painful and it is embarrassing to Paul to have to bring his resume out at all. He calls it boasting. As you read those 4 chapters, did you see as you read those chapters, I'll boast if I must. I'm boasting as a fool. In my foolishness, I'm boasting. Over and over, he's saying these things because it's just repulsive to Paul that he even has to bring out a resume at all. And so that's how he's feeling. As a Christian minister, as an apostle of Jesus, somebody is challenging him and saying, this is my resume, where's yours? And Paul is, I don't want to bring out my resume. I don't want to have to say anything about myself. And yet he does, because Paul sincerely cares about people. He cares about the church. And what's at stake is not really about Paul personally. What's at stake is really about people's faith. What's at stake is really about the gospel and about Jesus and about what it means to be a servant of God. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 through 20, that disciples need to beware of wolves in sheep's clothing. You remember? Beware of wolves in sheep's clothing, Jesus said. How will you know them? You remember what the Lord said? How are you going to know the wolves in sheep's clothing? How are you going to know the false teachers, the false prophets that arise among the people of God? How will you be able to determine who they are? Jesus said, by their fruits you shall know them. And that's really what 2 Corinthians chapter 11 is all about. By their fruits you shall know them. When I was a kid, I used to watch Saturday morning cartoons. Wile E. Coyote was one of my favorites. He never gave up, did he? Wile E. Coyote, he's always thinking of a new and a better way to get the Roadrunner. Well, in some of the cartoons, Wile E. Coyote decided he was going to steal sheep instead. You remember? And Sam the sheepdog was out there watching over the sheep, and you thought Sam was just oblivious and didn't know anything. And Wile E. Coyote would put on the sheepskin, but you could tell it was him. You could tell which one was the wolf in sheep's clothing. Not so when it comes to false apostles and false teachers. By their fruits, by their works, you shall know them. As you listen to what's being said in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, I want us to notice what really matters. When Paul pulls out his resume to show the church, to show people that he is a sincere, genuine apostle of Christ, what is it that he emphasizes? What is it that goes on his list? That's what we're going to study together this morning. As we begin our study of this passage, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, I want us to notice in the first place the insidious danger that faces the church. And it really boils down to two things in this case. There are many more dangers that face churches than these two, but these two are prominent in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Danger number one is this. And churches today, don't think for a minute that we don't struggle with these same dangers. An arrogance that stems from an ignorance or uncertainty about the gospel. We live in a day of uncertainty and ignorance when it comes to the people and the meaning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. A day of ignorance and uncertainty. If you're looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 4, Paul writes about how these false apostles have brought in a different Jesus and a different spirit and a different gospel. You see that? They're saying things that are different. They are not the gospel that was brought to them at the first. In other places, Paul writes, if anybody, even an angel, comes and preaches a different gospel than the one you've heard, let him be accursed. There's only one gospel. It came from God, and there is no uncertainty about what that gospel is comprised of. Galatians chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. And yet, the Corinthians allowed these false teachers to come into the church, and they stood up and taught some things and said some things that were not true, that were not right about who Jesus is and about what the gospel means. And the church tolerated it. The church said, on the whole, well, I guess there are some different interpretations and different perspectives about some of these things. There is a problem that develops in congregations when we are not certain, when we are not informed about what the gospel means and about who Jesus is and about what the spirit of Christianity is all about. There is a problem that develops, and the problem manifests itself when we become tolerant in areas where we should never be tolerant. As the people of God, there are some things that are not negotiable scripturally. And we become unwilling to say anything about things that we should really be convicted about. And ultimately that manifests itself in we have fellowship and we share and participate with and encourage and support people that we have no business encouraging or supporting or having fellowship with. Ephesians 5 verse 11 warns Christians, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. And when we become ignorant and uncertain about what the gospel is, there's a certain arrogance that can take over. Look at how open-minded we are. Look at how loving we are. And Paul's really concerned about that. Danger number 2 in this passage is what I'm going to call a triumphalism that values worldly success and accomplishments. In verses 13 through 15 of 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul says some things that are really, really sharp. In fact, some of the harshest language he uses anywhere. He says, these are deceitful, false apostles that are among you. And he calls them ministers of Satan. And he says, it's no wonder they look like wolves and they look like sheep. They're wolves in sheep's clothing. It's no wonder they look like that, because even Satan himself fashions himself into an angel of light. What's the point? The point is that these false apostles have come in and they have said things like this. Does this sound familiar? There's a better way to do ministry. There's a better way to gain converts. There's a better way to serve Jesus. And all we have to do is adopt our system and our philosophy and our model of doing things. And look at our resumes after all. We've gone to other congregations and we have had great success. Look at us and what we're able to do. And because people get caught up far too often in things like numbers and budgets, and because people get far too caught up in credentials and qualifications and in talents and abilities, because people start to worship those things and think those things are valuable, we can miss the point and we can value the wrong things. You know what happens when we start to boast in who we are and what we've accomplished and what we're able to do? When we start to boast in those things, number one, we become prideful before God and before others. But number two, we start to really look down our noses at people who are weak and even congregations that we perceive as weak, because we're not really all about the gospel. We're all about success and accomplishments. And those dangers, those faced the church in Corinth. And so, Paul, we want to see your resume. And that brings us, secondly, to Paul finally, after 3 chapters of agony, finally giving his resume to the church in what I'm going to call, secondly, an unusual approach. My grandfather fought in World War II. He was in the Pacific. I asked him on a number of occasions over the years before he passed away about some of his experiences. If you've ever known a war veteran who saw combat, it's hard to get them to talk about those things, isn't it? It's really difficult, and it was with my grandfather. In fact, he very little did he ever share with me about where he went, about what he did. I know some stories from others. That's kind of the way it is with Paul here. Paul doesn't want to talk about himself. He doesn't want to talk about his own life and his own resume. But because he loves the church, he's going to do it. And I want you to think for just a moment about what Paul could have done. As you look at 2 Corinthians chapter 11, I want you to look at verse 21. 2 Corinthians 11, verse 21. He says, "To my shame, I must say we were too weak to take advantage of you." That's how he begins the verse. And then he says, "Whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I am speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast of that." You know why he says, "I am speaking as a fool"? He's saying, I'm embarrassed to have to do this. I don't want to have to do this. Even when he gets down to verse 23, "Are they servants of Christ? I am a better one. I am talking like a madman," he says. I don't want to be talking about this. Like a war veteran who doesn't want to talk about combat that they've seen, Paul doesn't want to have to talk about himself, but he's doing it because it's about people's faith. If they don't believe what Paul says, if they don't believe the gospel that Paul preaches, they're going to be lost, because there is no other gospel, there is no other Jesus than the one that Paul preached. And therefore, they need to be confident that he truly is an authentic servant of God. And so look at what Paul does in his approach of talking about, are you an apostle of Jesus or not? Let's hear your resume, Paul. Listen to what he does. He talks in the first place about his heritage, because apparently that's what some of these false apostles were doing as well. Are you Jews? Are you Hebrews? Are you Israelites? So am I. I've got the same heritage and more that some of these false apostles have. These false apostles, verse 23, they claim to serve Jesus Christ. If they serve Jesus Christ, I serve him more, Paul says. But I'm speaking as a madman here. Is this really what Christians do? Do we compare and contrast who's a better servant of Jesus? Do we compare and contrast who's got a better heritage and background? Is that really what Christians are all about? I thought God said, humble yourself. I thought that Jesus said, if anyone would be great among you, let him be servant of all. If that's true, I'm speaking as a madman when I say these things. And then Paul does this. Some people think this passage beginning in verse 24 is what we might call a parody. If you've ever listened to Weird Al Yankovic, you know who I'm talking about? Weird Al Yankovic makes parodies of popular songs on the radio. He sings them his way, and he's kind of mocking and making fun in some ways. And some people think that that's kind of what Paul is doing here. Because these false apostles, these super apostles, they would stand up and they would say, I've been to other towns, and I've preached this message, and I've had tremendous results, great success. And listen to how eloquent and listen to how verbose I am, and think about how smart I am and my abilities and my talents, and listen to the kind of things I'm able to do. And they would list accomplishment after accomplishment after accomplishment after accomplishment. And what Paul does instead is to boast in his weakness. How do we know you're authentic, Paul? Paul begins in verse 24. Let me tell you about my experience, he says. Look at 2 Corinthians 11, verse 24. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews 40 lashes less one. And then he says in verse 25, 3 times I was beaten with rods. The Jews would beat you with lashes. And one of the things we learn in verse 24 is that Paul was consistent in going to the synagogues over and over and over. Everywhere he went, he kept trying to reach the Jews because the gospel's for the Jew first and then also for the Gentile. Romans chapter 1, verse 16. And you would think that Paul might give up after the first or second time that he was beaten with lashes, 39 lashes. But no, he kept on going 5 times. And then 3 times I was beaten with rods. That would have been the Gentiles, the Romans. We know of one of those occasions from Acts chapter 16 when Paul and Silas are arrested in Philippi and they're beaten with rods and put in the stocks. You remember in Acts 16? They're singing praises to God at midnight. Beaten with rods. But there were 2 other occasions where that happened. And Paul says, you want to know my credentials? You want to know what goes on my resume? Beaten with lashes by the Jews, beaten with rods by the Gentiles. But he doesn't stop there. He continues. He says, once I was stoned, verse 25. We know about that episode from the book of Acts. He says, 3 times I was shipwrecked, a night and a day I was adrift at sea. Think about this. As Paul traveled for the sake of Jesus, 3 shipwrecks, and most scholars believe this is before the Acts 27 shipwreck. If that's true, then Paul was shipwrecked at least 4 times in his ministry. Spent 24 hours in the sea. Again, what are your qualifications, Paul? Tell us about your accomplishments. He says in verse 26, I was on frequent journeys, and he lists 8 dangers. Look at this in verse 26. In danger from rivers, from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from the Gentiles, danger in the city, in the wilderness, and at sea. Doesn't matter where he went, Paul faced danger as a servant of God. Danger from false brothers, he says at the end of verse 26. And that in verse 26 is supposed to really cause the church to stop and think about what they're doing. Because you guys there in Corinth are listening to these false apostles who preach a different Jesus and a different gospel. You're listening to them. They're false brothers, and I have faced danger from them. And indeed, those false brothers were attacking Paul, and they were attacking his reputation. And then Paul says, I was in toil and hardship through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and in exposure. When Angie and I lived in Africa, our brethren in Africa would often go into the villages and the cities and try to teach people about the gospel. And oftentimes the question that would be asked is, well, where's your church building? And in most locations, there was no church building. In most locations in Africa, the church met in rented rooms. And you know what people said? If you're really the church that belongs to Jesus, if you're really the church of the Bible, why hasn't God blessed you with more than He's given you? Why don't you have a nice building like this denomination over here or that religious group over there? And people couldn't see that the way forward is to go to the back of the line. And the way up is to climb to the bottom of the ladder. And the way to have success in ministry is to humble yourself and to suffer. Cold and hunger, sleepless nights, deprivations of all kinds. Paul says, that's what I've put up with. That's what I've dealt with. You want to know about my resume? Paul could have talked about baptisms and miracles. He could have talked about signs and visions. He'd seen more. He'd traveled more miles than anybody else. But these are the things that go on his resume. Look at verse 28. As a preacher and elders, you need to listen up as well. verses 28 and 29 really need to sink down deeply into our hearts. Listen to what he says. And apart from other things, there is also the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. It's almost as if Paul is saying, all those things that I've been through, being shipwrecked and beaten and stoned and left for dead, all those things, those were bad. But the most difficult thing of all, verse 28, is my daily anxiety, my concern for the church. Paul was not a mere professional. He was not just a hireling. He wasn't just in this for the money he could make. In fact, he goes to great lengths in 2 Corinthians to prove and remind people, I didn't take any money from you guys. These false apostles, they're all about what they can get out of you. I didn't ask for anything, and I don't ask for anything, Paul says. I genuinely care about you as people, as Christians. I genuinely care about the church. The thing about ministry, brothers and sisters and friends, there's always some new fad. There's always some new way to do things. There's always some way that people have come up with that is effective and more and better. There's always that. I've seen it come and I've seen it go. But the only way to really make a difference in people's lives is by daily, one day at a time, one person at a time, caring for people, caring for their souls, teaching them the gospel, helping them to know Jesus better, whether they're lost, whether they're saved, loving people and working with people. And the thing about that is, and Paul would attest to this, it is extremely emotionally and spiritually expensive to do it. It'd be easier to retreat to a boardroom and come up with a plan, but to work with people. That's what Jesus did in his ministry. Jesus, isn't there a more efficient way to do things? No, I care about people, and that's where my attention needs to be. We need in the Lord's church more living room elders and fewer boardroom elders. Every church would be blessed by that. But it's also true that anxiety for the church that Paul describes, look at what he says in verse 29. He says, is someone weak and I'm not weak? What he's saying is when people are struggling, when people are dealing with difficulties and strife, that's how I feel too. And it's tough and it's difficult. When we do ministry that way, that's the way forward. But that doesn't look as flashy. That doesn't show up as well on a report. That doesn't look as nice on a resume. But that's how Paul talked about his ministry. Look again in verses 30 through 33. He talks about the time when he was let down out of the basket, out of the city of Damascus in a basket. People say, this is really strange that Paul would even bring this up. We're talking about his resume, his qualifications. How do you know that Paul's an authentic minister of Jesus? These are the things that he lists. Listen to what he says in verse 30. He says, if I must boast, if I've got to brag, I'm going to brag about things that show my weakness. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus, he who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. At Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down, verse 33, in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. And that's how Paul ends his resume. Think about this. Paul was on his way to Damascus as a Jewish man who was seeking to persecute the church. He had all kinds of pride and arrogance. He knew how to fix this. He knew how to get rid of this sect that had arisen that was denying that Judaism was enough. And he was going to persecute these Christians and he was going to drag them to prison. Proud and arrogant and confident. And then he goes to Damascus. He learns the truth about who Jesus is. He repents. He obeys the gospel. And the way he leaves Damascus, sneaking out in the middle of the night, in the most humiliating, shameful way he can imagine. And what Paul is saying is, that's really what matters. That there was enough of a change in my life that God, through me, showed the king of Damascus and a lot of the others that were there that there really is a Savior who's come And the gospel really does transform lives. And if I had to suffer shame because of that, I'm confident in that weakness. Talk about an unusual approach. The way forward is to go to the back of the line. The way up is down. The way to be blessed is to humble yourself. I want to share with you some powerful implications of this passage. As you look at 2 Corinthians chapter 11, lessons that we need to consider, all of us, in 2024. Implication number one, brothers and sisters and friends, especially when it comes to religious matters, but in general, we ought to be very reluctant to boast about ourselves. Romans chapter 12, verse 3 warns us not to think of ourselves more highly than we ought to think. And it really is amazing to me how painful it is for Paul to have to talk about his ministry. And in general, here's the rule that Paul followed as far as I can tell. The rule that he followed is this: if people are criticizing me personally, I'm going to let it go. But if what's happening and what's being said about me is impacting the church negatively, I'll deal with it. That's how he dealt with criticism. We ought to be reluctant, all of us, to boast about ourselves. What are you going to brag about? What do you have that wasn't given to you anyway? 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7. What do you have as a Christian that you're not just a steward of? Second, we need to hear this, brothers and sisters and friends. I believe this passage, 2 Corinthians 11, teaches that the heaviest burdens, the greatest burdens, the most painful burdens that Christians bear are in the heart, not the body. I really believe that's what verse 28 is telling us. It's the pain that Paul experienced in watching people walk away from the faith. The pain that Paul experienced in watching congregations be deceived by false teachers. Those are the things that really, Paul would say, are the most difficult things to bear. Shipwrecked, yeah, that was bad. Beaten with rods, yeah, terrible. Stoned, left for dead, that was not an experience I'd wish on my worst enemy. But to be concerned about people and about their souls, to worry about people that we love and that we care about, and that we can see are making terrible spiritual decisions and show no evidence that they're going to change. The Bible understands, Jesus understands that burden. Number three, it takes, brothers and sisters, courage, fortitude, and endurance to serve Jesus Christ faithfully. This is not a cruise ship, it is a battleship. And all of us who would serve Jesus need endurance. We need to realize that the road will be difficult if we take up our cross and follow him. That's why Jesus himself said, before you come to me, whoever does not forsake all that he has cannot be my disciple. Luke chapter 14, verse 33. Paul's evidence of that. And then fourth, brothers and sisters and friends, we need to be grateful people in a season of Thanksgiving. Do not make the mistake of taking for granted the price that others have paid so that you can enjoy gospel blessings. Paul dealt with all of this that we read this morning so that you could have confidence and certainty that the things he wrote are really from God. Think about that. We live in a day when people say things like this. Well, when it comes to women's role in the public worship, Paul said some things in 1 Timothy 2, and Paul said some things in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, but those seem to be cultural, and those seem to be his opinions. I don't think we should take those things too seriously. Paul went through all this so that we would take him seriously. You read Romans chapter 1 and what Paul writes about homosexuality and those kinds of relationships, and people say, well, that's just his culture being reflected. I don't know that we should take that too seriously. Paul was shipwrecked and beaten and carried anxiety so that we would take his words seriously, because what he communicates to us comes from the Holy Spirit himself. Don't take for granted, brothers and sisters and friends, the price that others have paid so that you can enjoy the blessings of the gospel. When it comes to getting things done, when it comes to effective ministry, when it comes to glorifying God, humble yourself. Jesus shows us that by doing the most shameful, humiliating thing that anyone's ever done, by dying on a cross for you and for me. And all Paul is doing in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 is writing about how he shared in those sufferings. Maybe you need to respond to the gospel this morning. The way up is down. Humble yourself before God. The way forward is to go to the back of the line. Listen to God's will. Receive with meekness his implanted word, which is able to save your soul. James chapter 1, verse 21. Believe that Jesus Christ really is who the Bible teaches that he is. He is divine. He is the Son of God. Repent of your sin. Be baptized, immersed in water, so that you can receive the forgiveness of sins. If you need to respond, won't you make your need known? While together we stand and while we sing.
All to Jesus I surrender.